The night they stripped her of everything, her title, her bond, her name. She did not beg. She stood in the center of the great hall, blood dripping black between her fingers, and looked at the man on the throne with eyes that had not yet learned to break. Outside, the silver forest waited in the cold like a sentence. They gave her no coat, no provisions, no mercy. They gave her exile and expected a grave. But someone had been watching from the north. A king who owed her nothing crossed a frozen mountain pass in the dark, alone, unannounced, without a single word of explanation. Why would the most feared alpha in the Carpathians risk everything for a woman the world had already decided to forget? Spring had come to Ashgard, but the courtyard smelled of old ash. A woman stood at its center in armor, the color of winter moonlight, silver-white plate engraved with patterns that did not belong to any house in this valley, patterns that moved like water when the light struck them at certain angles. Her hair, pale gold, lifted in the wind that swept down from the Carpathian peaks. She did not brush it from her face. She did not need to. Before her, a man knelt. He was broad-shouldered, auburn-haired, wearing the remnants of a king's dignity like a coat that no longer fit. His amber eyes were fixed on the stone beneath his knees. He did not look up. Perhaps he could not bear to. Beside the woman, slightly behind her right shoulder, stood another figure, tall enough that she reached only his collarbone. Dark-haired, dark-coated, the kind of still that suggested not patience but absolute economy. A man who moved only when there was something worth moving for. He was not watching the kneeling man. He was watching her. His eyes, the color of dark iron in shadow, did not leave her face. Seraphine looked down at Selim Vordain. No hatred crossed her expression. No triumph. What was there instead was harder to name and far colder than either. The particular stillness of someone who has passed through fire and come out the other side no longer afraid of heat. Then she turned her head, just slightly, toward the man beside her. Something changed in her eyes. Something small. Something that had nothing to do with victory. 6 years before, the first winter. The summons said, "Council session." Routine, the messenger had said. The Alpha King requests your attendance for a routine matter of governance. Seraphine de Voss had worn her best dress. She realized her mistake the moment the great doors of Ashgard's hall swung open. The torches burned too bright. The council seats were all filled. Every elder, every senior war captain, every clan head who could be reached in a fortnight's hard riding. Snow drove itself against the colored glass of the high windows, and the drafts that leaked through the stone floor made the flames bow and shiver. She walked in anyway. At the far end of the hall, on the carved obsidian throne that had been in the Vordain line for 11 generations, sat Selim. He was 26, and he had been king for 2 years, and the weight of it sat across his shoulders like a yoke. He was watching the middle distance when she entered. He did not turn to look at her. Behind the throne, to the left, stood Mireille du Chastel. She was not beautiful in any soft way. She was beautiful in the way that a weapon is beautiful, precisely, deliberately, in service of a purpose. Her arms were folded. The corner of her mouth was not quite a smile. Seraphine felt the shape of what was happening settle into her bones before anyone spoke. A body knows certain things. Her feet kept moving. She took her place at the center of the hall, and the doors behind her closed, and the echo of them rang up through the vaulted ceiling like a funeral bell. Selim read the charges without looking at her. His voice was even, practiced. She had heard him speak at council before, the careful cadence of a man who has learned to make difficult things sound inevitable. 2 years as her mate, 2 years during which her blood had not called her wolf, forward. Weak lineage, the document said. Evidence of abandoned covenant. The eastern borderlands were under pressure from Lord Draven of Morkai, and the pack required a Luna capable of standing in the gap between armies, not one who... He did not say one who cannot become what she needs to be. The document said it for him. Seraphine kept her eyes on his face. He kept his eyes on the parchment. Then, old Sir Aldrich Voss moved. She heard him before she saw him, the familiar drag of his bad leg, the crack of his walking staff against the stone. The oldest general in Ashgard, the man who had bounced her on his knee and taught her how to read star maps, stepped out from the edge of the hall with his chin up and his white hair wild around his weathered face. "The council has no authority to sever a mate bond," he said. His voice had not weakened with age. "What you're doing here tonight is not governance. It is Ren." 2 guards reached him before he could finish. They did not strike him. They were not quite brave enough for that, not with her watching. But they caught his arms and turned him, and as the doors opened to receive him, he wrenched his head back over his shoulder and shouted across the length of the hall. "Seraphine, your blood is not theirs. Remember that." Then the doors shut again. She stood very still, listening to the echo die. The silence that followed was the kind that asks for something. For tears, perhaps. For a plea. For some performance of helplessness that would let everyone in the room feel better about what was happening. Salem finally looked at her. His amber eyes were the color of old honey and just as opaque. She asked him one question. "Do you believe this?" Her voice came out calm. She had not told it to. "Or are you only afraid?" Something moved across his face, barely, quickly, like a stone skipping once on still water before it sank. His jaw tightened. He looked away. He read the words of formal severance. The mate bond breaking felt like a bell being struck inside her skull. Not a single strike, a long rolling series of impacts that started in her chest and radiated outward until her teeth ached with it. The mark on her left wrist went from cold to burning without passing through anything in between, and when she looked down, the faint pale brand had turned black at its edges and was lifting away from her skin like something rejected. She pressed her right hand over it. She did not make a sound. The blood that welled up between her fingers was very dark, nearly black in the torchlight. She watched it drip onto the flagstones and thought, absurdly, that it looked like ink, like something being written. She became aware that Mireille had not moved during any of this. The woman behind the throne had watched the entire proceeding with eyes the color of deep water, clear and empty and very still. That emptiness was more frightening than cruelty would have been. Cruelty, at least, would have been personal. The guards were coming. But Salem stepped down from the dais first. He crossed the distance between them quickly, quietly, and he stopped close enough that she could see the thin white scar along his jaw, where a training wound had healed badly. He bent his head. The words were for her alone. "I am sorry." She looked at him for one full second. "Sorry," she said, "is not warm enough to survive the night on." He stepped back. The guards stepped forward. They did not bind her. She was given that, at least, the dignity of walking out under her own power, flanked by 4 soldiers who kept their eyes forward and their mouths closed. They walked through the lower corridors and out through the eastern postern gate, and the cold hit her face like a wall. Outside the city walls, at the edge of Ashgard's territory, the stone road ended, and the silver forest began. The trees were black against the snow, and beyond them was darkness and the Carpathian peaks and nothing that belonged to her. One of the soldiers, young, barely past his first shave, waited until the others had turned back. Then he pulled the scarf from around his own neck and pressed it into her right hand without looking at her, and walked away quickly, as though he were afraid of what her expression might do to him. She looked down at the wool in her hand. It was still warm from his skin. She wrapped it around her left wrist, over the wound, and walked into the trees. 3 days. On the first, she ate bark scraped from the white birches and packed snow against the wound when the throbbing got too insistent. Her body, which should have been shutting down by the end of the first night, did not. She walked until she was tired, slept in the shelter of a standing stone that had no business being this deep in the forest, and woke up the next morning still breathing. She did not know why. She filed it away. On the second night, the darkest of the 3, she found a hollow beneath an overhang of rock and crawled inside. The wind could not reach her there. She lay on her side on the frozen earth, and for the first time since the hole, she cried. Not from fear, not from cold. She cried because she had suddenly thought, very clearly, that when she died in this forest, no one would know her name within a generation. The council would write its own record. Salem would not contradict it. And Sir Eldrick, who would tell the truth, was old and getting older. She let herself have the grief. Then she packed it away somewhere tight and internal, the way one packs a wound, and slept. On the morning of the 3rd day, the snow stopped. She found the tracks at first light, massive, clawed, pressed deep into the crust in a pattern that was wrong for a wolf. Too light a stride, too much weight per step. Whatever had made these prints had passed through sometime in the night, and it had been moving east, toward warmth, perhaps, or toward the higher ground, where the conifers grew dense enough to break the wind. She followed them. He saw her first. She would learn this later. At the time, she was simply aware, with the animal alertness, that 3 days of near starvation had honed to a point, that she was being watched. The sensation did not come with fear. It came with a kind of flat assessment, the way a body counts threats before the mind has caught up. She kept walking. Her hands were open at her sides. The rogues came from the left, 3 of them, large and grey and moving low through the underbrush in the patient way of animals that have done this before, and expected to end only one way. They had caught her scent on the wind. She was easy prey, injured, alone, moving slowly. They knew it. She knew it, too. She picked up a fallen branch. It was the length of her forearm and would last approximately 2 seconds against an adult rogue wolf, and she knew that also. She turned to face them anyway. The first one came in low and fast, and then something came through the trees. She registered only impressions, size, speed, the sound of impact like a boulder dropped from height. The rogue that had been mid-lunge was simply gone, taken sideways into the snow with a force that shook the nearest trees. The second and third wheeled to face the new threat, and there was a scream of animal pain, and then quiet. Snow sifted down from disturbed branches. The figure that turned toward her stood roughly 2 meters tall in its human form, and it moved back into it with an ease that looked almost like boredom, a slow unfolding, a settling back into familiar proportion. Black hair, disordered from the change. A coat that was somehow, improbably, still in good condition. A scar that began at his left temple and curved down past his jaw toward his throat, old enough to have gone silver. He looked at the branch in her hand. His eyes, when they met hers, were the dark iron grey of a winter sky before snow, steady, measuring, giving nothing away. They dropped to the branch. Then, back to her face. "You intended to fight a rogue wolf," he said with that. It was not quite a question. "It was the only weapon available," she said. The words came out steadier than she expected. She was very cold, and her left wrist had started bleeding again through the wall, and she had not eaten anything that qualified as food in 3 days, but her voice came out steady. He looked at her for another moment. Then, "What is your name?" "Seraphine de Voss und Koi." Something shifted in his expression, a fractional thing, gone before she could place it. He said, "Riven Ashvale." Then, as though the conversation had been concluded, "Come, there is a fire." The cave was barely large enough to be called one, a deep notch in the rock face, barely wide enough for two, with a fire already burning low at the back and a bedroll that suggested occupation. He crouched before the fire and fed it without looking at her. Seraphine sat. The warmth hit her all at once, the way cold water hits the face, not gently, not gradually, but as a single comprehensive impact that the body responds to before the mind can intervene. She started shaking, not the trembling of fear, but the deep, involuntary shuddering of muscles that had been clenched against cold so long they did not know how to unclench. A weight landed in her lap. She looked down, a large square of cured bear hide, heavy and smell of smoke and animal, and warm in the way that things are warm when they have been compressed and carried close to a body. She pulled it around her shoulders. "Your shoulder," he said. He was still looking at the fire. She followed his gaze to the dark stain spreading from the right shoulder of her ruined dress. The rogue had caught her when she turned. She had not really registered it, not fully, not with everything else. She looked at it now. "I've had worse," she said. This was not true. She had not actually ever had anything worse, but it seemed like the right thing to say. He exhaled once through his nose. He turned and sat beside her, not quite close enough to touch, and reached for the leather pack at the back of the cave. She watched his hands as he worked. They were large, knuckled, the kind of hands that had been used hard for a long time. Watched him withdraw cloth strips and a small clay pot of something that smelled of pine resin and something sharper underneath. "May I?" he said. It was not a question either, but he waited. "Yes," she said. He shifted to face her, and she turned so the wound was accessible, and she found herself very aware that the distance between them was less than a forearm's length, and that this was the closest she had been to another person's warmth in 3 days. He pulled back the ruined edge of her sleeve with fingers that moved carefully, exactly, more carefully than their size suggested they needed to. The wound was cleaned, the salve applied, the bandages wrapped. She sat still through it and watched his face from a distance of 8 inches, close enough to see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the places where weather had left its signature, the particular way his jaw held when he was concentrating, tight at the hinge, the muscle beneath the skin, moving in small, controlled adjustments. Then his thumb, following the line of the last bandage around her wrist, grazed something. He stilled. She looked down. His fingers had stopped at the inside of her left wrist, at the scar that the bond severance had burned into her skin, smooth and dark and shaped, inexplicably like a closed eye. He did not ask. She watched him not ask. She watched the muscle in his jaw tighten once, smoothly, and then settle, and he finished tying off the bandage and withdrew his hands. The fire cracked. Wind moved across the cave mouth. Somewhere above, snow shifted and fell with a sound like paper. "Who did this to you?" he said. He was looking at the wall behind her shoulder. "Someone I thought would not." He looked at her then. His eyes were very direct in a way she had not fully prepared for. 1 second of full attention, the weight of it almost physical. "You will not die tonight," he said. She believed him. She did not entirely understand why. She woke some time later to find the fire rebuilt, and him sitting beside it, arms resting on his knees, watching the flames. She had, at some point while sleeping, shifted sideways, and her back was against the cave wall, and her shoulder was not quite touching his. She could feel the heat radiating from him, through the cold air between them. She watched him through the gap between her lashes. He was looking at her left wrist, where the scar was hidden beneath the bandage. His face, in the firelight, held the particular expression of a man working out the dimensions of something he doesn't yet have language for. She closed her eyes before he could turn. She woke to light that came from the wrong direction. Not the gray sideways light of the forest, but something vertical, torchlight, reflected off walls that were close and stone and dark. She was on a raised pallet with wool blankets piled over her, and the ceiling was too high to see clearly, and the air smelled of pine smoke and iron, and something she couldn't name, something ancient and mineral and northern. "You're awake," said a voice she did not recognize. She turned her head. A woman sat in a chair beside the pallet, compact, brown skin, with short cropped dark hair and the shoulders of someone who carries weapons for a living. She was holding a bone needle and looking at Seraphine the way a craftsperson looks at a problem they've already begun solving. 4 days, the woman said, before Seraphine could ask. "Fever broke this morning. You're at Citadel Duskmoor, which is in the Carpathian Highlands, which means you survived a thing that almost certainly should have killed you. I'm Nara. I've changed your bandages 3 times, and twice you've swung at me while unconscious, which I respect." Seraphine stared at her. "Seraphine de Voss," said a different voice. He was seated at a table to her left, reading something that looked like a military survey. He had not looked up. He was here, in a room this size, in the same air, and she had not felt it until he spoke. That struck her as remarkable. "Riven," she said. Her voice came out rusty with disuse. "How did I get here?" "I carried you." Still reading. "You became incoherent on the 3rd hour of the return journey. I made the decision to carry you, rather than wait for you to ask." Nara snorted. "Very romantic story. We tell it at the dinner table." The corner of his mouth did not move, but the corner of his eye did. Nara.indan. Amene Gigari. "I'm just saying." The woman talked as she worked, changing the bandages, cataloging the damage, explaining the citadel in the brisk, unjudgmental way of someone who gives tours for a living. Seraphine listened and watched the ceiling and thought about what Sir Aldrich had shouted across the hall. "Your blood is not there." She had not understood it then. "Your fever didn't come from the wounds," Nara said, her hands very gentle around Seraphine's wrist. "The wounds are clean. The fever came from something else. Something inside you fighting with itself." She paused. "Has this happened before? Extended cold exposure where your body kept going longer than it should have?" "Yes," Seraphine said. "I assumed I was stubborn." "You are stubborn. But that's separate." Nara sat back. "Tell me, what do you know about dormant lichen lineage?" "I know it's supposedly a myth." "It's not." Nara pressed 2 fingers to the pulse point at Seraphine's throat, then at her wrist, then against her sternum. "Someone with pure lichen blood in their line, very far back, under enough pressure. The right kind of pressure. Will eventually. She made a gesture like something unfolding. "But it takes time, and it hurts, and the body tries to eat itself first." Seraphine absorbed this. "The Voss line," said Riven from across the room. He had finally put down the survey. He was looking at her now, not at her face, but at a point slightly above and to the left of her, as though reading something in the air beside her head. Then his eyes moved to hers, and she held them, because she had learned in the past 3 days not to be the first to look away. "I received a letter," he said, "several weeks ago, from a general of Ashgard." He stood and crossed to the table beside her pallet and laid down a single folded sheet. Old paper, the ink slightly blurred at the folds. He wrote to any northern power still in existence. He didn't know if anyone was listening. She recognized the handwriting before she recognized the content. The loops of the letters, the slight leftward lean, the way the full stops were pressed just a little too hard. She read it with her hands very still in her lap. It was short. Ser Aldrich had never been a man for long letters. He wrote that he had a niece whose blood he had watched all her life and never been able to name, and that the council was moving against her, and that he could not stop them, and that if anything of the old world remained in the Northern Highlands, he was asking, not demanding, not petitioning, asking for any kindness available. Asking for any kindness available. "She does not know what she is yet," the letter ended. "But I do. Please find her before the cold does." Seraphine sat with the letter in her lap for a long moment after she'd finished reading. The paper was smooth under her fingertips. It had been handled often, refolded many times. "He loved you," said Riven. "He was the only one who did." She said it plainly, not for sympathy. It was simply the most accurate sentence available. A pause. "Then, he wrote to a stranger and asked for kindness. That is not the letter of a man who has made peace with losing someone." She looked up. He was watching her with that quality of attention she'd noticed in the cave, the kind that did not perform itself, that had no social component, that simply landed and stayed. Her chest did something complicated that she chose not to examine. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," he said, "we wait to see if you're strong enough to survive what comes next." The night before the awakening, she could not sleep. She stood on the narrow balcony outside her quarters and watched the valley go dark below the citadel, the birch forest first, then the foothills, then nothing at all except the high stars and the white shapes of the peaks. Her breath made small ghosts in the air. She had not thought to bring a coat. She heard the door behind her open and close. He came to stand at the railing, not beside her but half a step back, the way he always positioned himself, present but not imposing, available without insisting on it. The wind came in off the mountains, and she felt it find the gap at her collar. He did not comment on her lack of a coat. He simply unbuttoned his own and held it out, wordlessly, at the edge of her peripheral vision. She looked at the coat, then at him. "You'll be cold," she said. "No," he said, which was simply true. His kind ran warmer than most. She took it. She pulled it around her shoulders, and it was heavy and smelled of pine smoke and iron, and the particular northern cold that had slowly become, over the past weeks, something she associated with safety. The distance between them on the narrow balcony was perhaps 2 handspans. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Are you afraid?" he asked eventually. He was looking at the valley. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "No," she said. "I should be, but what I feel is more like..." She searched for it, standing at the edge of a roof in high wind, not afraid of falling, afraid of what it means to be the kind of thing that doesn't fall. He was quiet. "Did it hurt?" she asked. "For you?" "Yes." Simple, with nothing added to soften it. "Did you get through it?" He turned his head and looked at her, full attention, the 2 handspan distance between them suddenly a different kind of measurement. His dark iron-gray eyes in the starlight were very steady. You already know the answer to that. The wind moved across the balcony. Below them, the valley was perfectly dark and perfectly still. "Come in soon," he said. "You need the sleep you can get." He went inside. She stayed a while longer, wearing his coat, watching the stars wheel slowly over the Carpathian peak. The coat was still warm. The awakening was not a metaphor. It was not a gradual unfolding or a symbolic journey inward. It was 8 hours in a stone chamber below the citadel, with every bone in her body attempting to rearrange itself into something her blood had apparently always intended, while her nervous system registered each rearrangement as mortal catastrophe. Riven sat on the floor beside her. He did not promise it would be over soon. He did not tell her she was doing well. He simply stayed, which was the only honest thing anyone could have offered. At some point in the 5th hour, she found his wrist in the dark and wrapped her fingers around it. Her grip was not gentle. He didn't make a sound. At the 6th hour, she came back to herself long enough to say, between her teeth, if I don't get through this, don't. The word was quiet and flat and final. Riven. Silence. Then, so quietly she felt it more than heard it. Because I don't want to hear it. She looked at his face in the blue pre-dawn dark of the chamber. It was very controlled, the way things are controlled when the control requires effort. She understood something then that she did not yet have words for. She turned back to the dark and held on. Dawn came through the ventilation slits near the ceiling in thin gray bars. She rose. Not as Seraphine de Voss of Ashgard, cast out and left for dead. Something older and wilder wore her shape now, silver-white, the fur so pale it held the blue of pre-dawn in its depths, a body that moved close to the ground with the liquid economy of something built for speed rather than mass. Smaller than him, she understood at some animal level. But faster. Her eyes, storm-gray in human form, burned now with the cold electric blue of a sky before lightning, and the breath that moved through her was not Carpathian winter, but the thing that makes Carpathian winter. She turned to face him. He was standing. He had risen at some point in the last hour without her hearing it, and he stood very still at the edge of the room, and he was watching her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not surprise, exactly. Not wonder. Something that had been sealed behind those dark eyes for a long time, and was now pressing quietly at the glass. She shifted back. It came slowly, the return to human form, the familiar lines of her own body reassembled from something larger and stranger. She stood in the light of the new morning, breathing. He bowed. Not the bow of a subject to a ruler, not the bow of a victor to the defeated, the bow of a man who recognizes something he respects. "Welcome back," he said. "Seraphine de Voss, Polniode, Yenaiwan, Adam Tiller." A pause. "You have always been here. Someone only needed to stop standing in your way." She stood in the light of the new morning and felt, for the first time in her life, like something that could not be taken from her. The first year, he trained her before dawn every morning. She learned this about him. He was rigorous without cruelty, demanding without contempt. He showed her something once correctly. If she failed at it, he showed her again. He did not explain why she had failed. He trusted her to understand it herself, and the trust was, she found, more motivating than any instruction could have been. The 38th time she fell in the snow during a sparring round, she lay there looking up at the grey Carpathian sky and thought about giving up. Not seriously, but the thought crossed the field of her mind like a shadow. A hand appeared in her peripheral vision. She looked up at it, then up at him, standing over her, arm extended, his expression exactly as unreadable as always. She took the hand. He pulled her upright in one smooth movement. It was the first time he had reached for her since the cave. She noticed. She did not say anything. The Ashgard, Riven's 300, his wolves, his shadow company, watched her the way they watched everything, without expression, without comment. She watched them back. She catalogued the tells. The slow blink, that meant approval. The particular stillness around their shoulders, that was not rest, but evaluation. She was being measured constantly, and she refused to manage it. She simply trained and fell, and stood up and trained again. By the end of the first year, she had earned one thing. She was no longer invisible in the hall when she walked through it. 6 months into her second year, she was in the library. It was past midnight, and she was sitting cross-legged on the cold stone floor with a massive volume of lichen historical text open across her knees, and she was stuck on 3 words in a dialect that predated any modern Carpathian tongue by 4 centuries. She heard footsteps. She knew them, the particular measured rhythm, the slight longer pause on the left foot where an old injury had healed 10 degrees off true. She did not look up. He stopped in the doorway. She could feel him looking at her the way she could feel the warmth from the torches, not contact, but presence. "Those words," she said, "are in what language exactly? Because the gloss says Northern Dacian, but the consonant clusters are completely what?" "Proto, Likan." He came into the room. He sat across from her, not beside, but across, the open book between them. He looked at the 3 words. Vila Sorak, Neth. The syllables rolled differently in his mouth than they did when she tried them, rounder, more certain of themselves. Roughly, the bond that is chosen, as opposed to one assigned by moon or blood. There's a distinction? There is a word for the distinction, which means it mattered enough to name. She looked at him over the book. In the torchlight, he was all shadow and angle, the planes of his face, the dark of his hair, the long line of that scar. He was looking at the text, not at her. "Sit here," she said, and moved the book aside. He sat beside her. She turned the book back between them, and they read, and he translated the old words when she needed them, and she asked questions that were not always about the text, and he answered them. At some point, she stopped noticing the cold of the floor. At some point, the torches burned lower, and neither of them reached to replace them. She told him about Ashgard in the summers when she was small, the orchards behind the citadel, the way the river flooded every spring and her uncle would take her to watch the salmon run. He told her about the Carpathian winters, about the 3-year period a century ago when the passes were so deep in snow that the citadel had become genuinely isolated, and how the records from that period were written in a shorthand no one now living fully understood. When the first grey light showed at the eastern windows, she realized she had been in this room for 6 hours. "Training at dawn," he said. "I know." She looked at him. He was close, she realized, had drawn closer by degrees over the course of the night, the way warmth draws things toward it without announcing its intention. She could see the individual lashes at the corner of his eye. It was worth it. He stood. She stood. They looked at each other across the distance that had somehow become very small. The muscle at the corner of his jaw moved, precisely once, and then he turned toward the door. "You'll be slow," he said. "I know." "Come anyway." She smiled at his back, in the empty library, where no one had to see her do it. By the 3rd year, things had shifted in ways that were not quite articulable. Kane, the Ashgard sub-commander, a man of roughly Riven's height but twice his silence, was observed one evening, by multiple witnesses, turning to the man beside him in the barracks and saying, "The king has changed." "In what way?" A long pause. "He takes longer to make decisions." "That sounds worse, not better." "It is not worse." Kane went back to his work. The matter was apparently closed. In the training yard, Seraphine pinned ribbon to the snow for the first time on a grey morning in early October, the kind of morning that smells of wood smoke and the coming cold, when the first frost has traced its white script across the stones. She was straddling his sword arm, her knee pressing the relevant joint, and she looked down at him with her heart hammering in her throat and waited for him to concede. He looked up at her. His face did 3 things in rapid succession that she had no reference for, and then it was smooth again. "Again," he said. "I just won." "I know. Again." And she heard it, something under the word, something more than tactical stubbornness. He wanted to see if he could be beaten by her twice. Not by an opponent. By her specifically. She won again. He said nothing at dinner, but she caught him watching her once, across the long stone table, when he thought she was occupied with Nara, and the look on his face was one she had begun to collect privately, the ones she caught when he didn't know she was looking, and file away somewhere under a heading she had not yet named. By the fire on a night in the 3rd autumn, with the mountains invisible behind cloud, and the wind finding every gap in the stones, she told him about Sir Aldrich. She had received word through a travelling merchant, one of the informal channels the citadel kept open to the lowlands, that her uncle was ill, not dying, but old in the way that becomes visible all at once, the way ice goes from solid to broken very suddenly after a long winter. She told him this without looking at him. She was watching the fire. He listened the way she had learned he listened, completely, and without filling the silences with noise. When she stopped talking, he didn't ask follow-up questions. He sat with what she'd said for a moment. "Then, he knows you're alive. For a man like that, it is enough." "How do you know that?" "Because he did not write that letter as a man who had already mourned. He wrote it as a man buying time." A pause. The way a soldier holds a line until relief arrives. She looked at him then. He was watching the fire. The flames moved behind his eyes in small hot points. The distance between them on the fallen log was perhaps 60 centimeters. She was aware of it, the way she was aware of the cold beyond the fire's reach. A gradient measurable. She did not move. Neither did he. Sometime later, she could not have said how much. She felt herself listing sideways in the particular way that comes not from exhaustion but from the body's deep decision that it is safe. She was asleep before she understood what was happening. She did not feel him move, but she felt, distantly, through the fog of sleep, the weight of something settling over her with great deliberateness, his cloak, wool heavy and warm, carrying pine smoke and winter cold. Felt his hand smooth it once across her shoulder. Felt him stop. Felt him stay. She heard, in the vast silence of the Carpathian night, exactly nothing, but the absence of movement, the specific stillness of a person who has decided to remain, was its own kind of language. The letter from Ashgard arrived on a morning in the 5th year. It was not addressed to Seraphine. It was addressed to any sovereign power in the Northern Highlands, in the desperate, indiscriminate way of drowning men throwing ropes in all directions. Lord Draven of Morkai had deployed siege engines along Ashgard's eastern wall. The city had 7 days, perhaps 10, before the lower districts ran out of food. Talem had written it. She recognized the handwriting the way she'd recognized her uncle's, involuntarily, from the body outward. She stood before Duskmoor's War Council and presented the case for intervention with every piece of military logic she could construct, which was considerable by that point. The elders listened. She knew they were listening not to the argument, but to the manner of making it, watching for signs of vengeance, for personal motivation masquerading as strategy. She kept her voice level and her hands open on the table, and confined herself to outcomes and practicalities. When she finished, she looked at Riven. He was watching her, not the council. His arms were crossed, and his face held its usual careful neutrality. But his eyes had that quality she'd catalogued, fully present, fully arrived. He said, to the room, "We march at first light." There were logistics to manage, supplies to organize, routes to map. She dealt with them. Hours passed in purposeful motion. It was late, then very late, then the particular dead hour of night that exists only in barracks and citadels and hospitals, the hour when everything necessary has been done, and sleep has not yet been earned, when she stood before the piece of polished steel that served as a mirror in the armory, and looked at herself in her new armory, and looked at herself in her new armory. It was silver-white, darkened at the joins to a deep pewter. The engraving on the shoulder plates had taken the Citadel's metalsmith 3 weeks. She looked at the woman in the metal and thought, "You are not who you were in that hall. You are not recognizable to the person who asked Selim Vordain if he was afraid." The door opened behind her. He came in to check the fittings. This was an official function, the kind of pre-campaign inspection that a commanding officer performs as a matter of course. He began at the shoulder, his fingers finding the closure and testing the tolerances, and she watched him do it in the metal surface. He was frowning slightly in concentration, the way he frowned when something technical required full attention. His fingers paused on the left shoulder closure. The same shoulder where the rogue had bitten her, where she had held still in a cave while his hands worked a bandage around a wound. She looked at his reflection, and his eyes came up to find hers in the metal. The distance between them, at that moment, was approximately 10 centimeters. She could feel the warmth from his hands through the armor. "Riven," she said. She did not know what she intended to follow it with. "Don't." He stepped back. A full step, precise, deliberate. His hands came down to his sides. "After." The word landed differently than she expected. Not a refusal. Something with weight in it. "Why after?" "Because if I say it now, you'll be thinking about it when you should be watching your left side." A pause. The muscle in his jaw. "And I refuse to be the reason you're not paying attention." She studied his reflection. "Is that the only reason?" A beat of silence. The kind she had learned to read, the ones that contained things he was not ready to put into words. "No," he said, and left. She stood in the armor in the empty armory and listened to the silence he'd walked away into. Her pulse was doing something it had not done since the mate bond broke. Not the wrenching absence of that severance, but something quieter, warmer, like a door open a crack onto a lit room. She breathed it in and went to sleep. They came down out of the mountains in the thin grey hour before true dawn, 300 wolves moving in formation through the silver forest. And the trees gave way to the valley road, and Ashgard rose ahead of them, with Draven siege engines ranked along its eastern face like broken teeth. The Ashen Guard did not use horns or banners. They simply appeared. The sound that a Lycan king makes entering a battlefield is not a sound that can be fully prepared for. It is the auditory equivalent of a stone dropped into still water, a displacement so absolute that everything around it must reorganize. Riven rode into the valley at the head of the column, and Seraphine felt the ripple of it move through the soldiers ahead of them. First the rogues, then Draven's hired force, then even, she could see it from here, the the defenders on Ashgard's walls. She rode on his right. Behind them came. They did not speak on the way in. There was nothing to say. The battle lasted 5 hours. She fought in the eastern corridor where the siege engine stood, the most technically complex of the engagements, requiring timing and the ability to move through spaces simultaneously full of smoke, stone, and falling metal. She found she was not afraid. She found she was, in fact, very focused. In the second hour, she shifted. The silver-white form burst through the corridor's smoke, and the engine operators scattered, and she moved through the machinery the way water moves through a gap, inevitable, finding every weakness in the structure, pulling with her jaws at the ropes and chains that held the counterweights aloft, until the great frames groaned and listed and came down. She shifted back while the dust was still rising, her human form already moving to the next position, her mind counting angle. Lord Draven's personal guard caught her at the corridor's end in the third hour. 6 men, armored, spreading to cut off retreat with the organized calm of soldiers who have done this before. She did not try to go through them. She went over, catching the lintel of a collapsed archway, pulling herself above the reach of their pikes, and dropping behind the man at the back before any of them had reoriented. The guard reduced itself from 6 to 1, and that one was Draven. He was a man of middle age and middle height, who had accumulated power the way certain men do, through patience, through the exploitation of others' crises, through being willing to do what people with more to lose were not. He looked at her when she stepped forward and saw, she thought, a woman he had not planned for. His eyes moved to the silver-white fur, still dusting her coat from the shift, then to her face. "Who are you?" he said. "Seraphine de Voss, Sjani, and Emil, Ememesht." The words came out clean and final, the way things come out when they have been true for a long time, and are only now being spoken into the right air. "Remember the name." His sword came up. She did not move away from it. She moved into it, inside his reach before the arc could complete, and what happened next was a conversation that swords have when one of them is held by someone with nothing left to lose and everything to become. She left him living. The choice was deliberate. He would remember what mercy cost her and spend the rest of his life understanding that she had chosen it. She made sure he would not forget. The silence after is always strange. She had read about this but not experienced it. The way battles end not all at once but in patches. The way the noise subsides from one corner and then another, and you stand in the diminishing uproar and your body, which has been running on something purer and simpler than thought, begins to register things it was not attending to before. The cold, the weight of the armor, the distance between her lungs and the air. She changed back to human form on the eastern side of the wall, in view of the people on the battlements. The silver-white wolf that had been visible through the smoke became a woman in pewter and silver armor, pale gold hair disordered from the fighting, standing in the winter light without apology. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then someone on the wall said a name. Not loudly, not in triumph, in the particular tone of disbelief that something true produces when it contradicts something you had been told. Seraphine. She looked up and saw Sir Aldrich being supported between 2 young soldiers, his white hair loose, his eyes finding her across the courtyard with the unerring accuracy of a man who has been looking for something for a very long time. She ran. She had not, in 5 years, run toward anything. She had moved with calculation and precision and control, always. Her feet found their own way now, without consulting her. She hit the courtyard at full speed and stopped herself 2 feet from him, and then simply stood there while he reached out and put one hand against her face, the way you check if something fragile is still whole. "You're taller," he said. "Liar," she said. Her voice had come out wrong, too thick, too uneven. He laughed. Then he was crying. She had not seen him cry in 31 years. She stood there and let him hold her face in both his hands, the old general's palms rough and warm, and above them, on the battlements, soldiers who had never met her were doing something she would not recognize for several seconds as applause. She looked back, once, across the courtyard. Riven was standing 30 meters away, beside the wall. He was not looking at the crowd or the battlements, or the aftermath of the siege engines they were dismantling. He was watching her. His face, just for a moment, just for one moment, while he did not know anyone was looking, was open in a way she had never seen it. Something raw and unguarded in the dark iron gray of his eyes. The kind of expression that a man wears when he sees the thing he has been afraid of losing, and it has not been lost. Cain, who was standing at Riven's left shoulder, also saw it. He turned away. Later, when the courtyard had cleared, Seraphine found Selim at the edge of the inner yard. He was thinner. The 2 years since she'd last seen him had removed something from around the eyes. Not age exactly, but the removal of a scaffolding he'd been relying on. He stood without his guard, without Mireille at his back, and he waited. He did not approach. "She's gone," he said, when Seraphine came near. His voice held no accusation. "Mireille, she left 3 days ago when word reached us that you were coming down from the mountains." He was quiet for a moment. "The Ashgard found her in the Silberwald, trying to reach Morkai. She has been brought back. She will answer to whatever council you choose." He said it plainly, without drama, a man issuing a report on his own failure. "I understood, when she left, that I had spent 2 years governing with someone else's judgment." "I know," Seraphine said. "I would like to formally acknowledge the terms your council sends." He was looking at her steadily, the amber of his eyes carrying something complicated. "But, first," he looked past her, at Riven. "Who is he to you?" She turned her head. Riven was standing 6 feet behind her. He had not moved closer. He would not. She understood this about him, his absolute scrupulousness about spaces that were hers to manage. He held eye contact with Selim for a moment, then moved his gaze to her. She looked at him. He looked at her. A second passed, possibly 2. "Everything," she said, without breaking that gaze. "That I chose, and that chose me back." Selim closed his eyes. When he opened them, something in his face had resolved into a simpler shape. "I understand," he said quietly. "I understand what I gave up. I understand that I gave it up freely, and that you owe me nothing." "No," she said. "I don't." "Then let me at least say this." He looked at her directly, the way he had not, for a very long time. "I was afraid. You were right. I was afraid. And I made it your catastrophe, and I am sorry. Not because I expect it to change anything, but because it is simply true." She received this. She held it for a moment. "I know," she said, and she meant it, and she moved on. The formal reading of the Voss Accord happened in the inner courtyard, before witnesses from both territories. Seraphine read it herself. She had written most of it in consultation with Duskmoor's council over 3 weeks of correspondence. It was a practical document: trade routes, garrison arrangements, the legal frameworks for a unified northern territory. She read it in a clear voice that carried to the back of the courtyard, and she did not read it for Selim. She read it for the people of Ashgard, who had not asked to be ruled by a man who made catastrophic personal decisions and then distributed the consequences. At the end, she lowered the scroll. "Selim Vordain," she said. "Do you understand these terms?" He had stood through the entire reading. He was standing now without his sword, without his guard, without Mireille at his back telling him what to think. He was, she thought, more himself in this moment than she had seen him in years. The stripped version. The one that might have been something different under different conditions. "I understand them," he said. "Then kneel." He went down without hesitation. Not the desperate drop of a man who has no choice. A slow, deliberate descent, the kind that requires a decision at every stage. He looked up at her when he reached the ground, and his amber eyes held something she had not expected. Recognition. "Not because you won," she said quietly. "You could kneel because you won. Kneel because it is the right thing." "It is the right thing," he said. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, precisely, and turned to address the rest of the courtyard, and the accord was ratified, and it was done. Later, when the courtyard had cleared, she found her uncle on the stone bench near the eastern gate, where he had always liked to sit because the afternoon light came through the archway at the right angle to be useful for reading maps. He was not reading maps now. He was watching her come across the courtyard with the expression of a man who has looked a long way into the future and found it, improbably, adequate. She sat beside him. The stone was cold. Neither of them said anything for a while. "He watches you," Aldrich said, eventually. "I know. Has been watching you since you crossed the courtyard this morning." "I know." He turned to look at the wall, where Riven was standing at a pillar some 30 meters away, not watching them, with very great deliberateness not watching. "Old," said her uncle, "not blind." "Go to sleep," Seraphine told him. He patted her hand, the rough pressure of old affection. "Go. I'll be here." She stood. She looked at him. His white hair, his weathered face, the walking staff propped against the bench beside him. And she thought, he held a line. He had held the line until the relief arrived, the way he'd always said a good soldier holds it. "Thank you," she said, "for the letter." He waved a hand. "Go find your king." The first 2 months in Ashgard had been almost entirely administrative, the daily work of governance that is nothing like governing, but everything like managing systems that have been neglected for too long or managed for the wrong reason. She had done it without complaint because she was good at it, and because the people of Ashgard deserved someone who would do the work without resentment. Riven had been there, not leading, present in the way he was present, slightly behind her right shoulder, available, attending. They had come back to Duskmoor when the new year turned, when the most urgent structures were in place, and the interim administrators had found their footing, and they had come back changed in the way that people are changed by months of working alongside each other in close quarters. The last of the formal distances had worn smooth, the way stones were smooth, the way stones were smooth, the way railings but by the patient accumulation of current. Spring. Can. The snow was still on the peaks, but it had retreated from the lower citadel, and the light that came through the high windows in the afternoons was a different color. Thinner, more diffuse, carrying the particular quality of light that exists only in the Carpathian quality of light that exists only in the Carpathian spring, as though the sun were not yet sure it was welcome and was making itself as inoffensive as possible. The evening it happened, she was standing on the northern balcony. The stone under her hands was rough from a century of winters. Below, the valley was purple in the failing light, the birch forest at its edges showing the first blush of green that would become full canopy in another month. The air was cold in the particular way of spring cold, not hostile, just honest. She was not wearing her armor. She was wearing a dark wool coat of Nara's, and her own boots, and nothing that marked her as anything except a person standing in the evening air. She heard the door. He came onto the balcony behind her. She heard him stop. She heard the particular quality of the silence that followed, not the pause before speech, but a longer hesitation, as though he had arrived at a place where the familiar markers had run out. She did not turn. "It's done," she said, the simplest summary of the last 8 months. "It's done," he said. Wind. Below them, a bird crossed the last light over the valley. "You said after," she said, "on the night before we marched." She turned then, and found him closer than she'd expected. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that she could see the small scar at his lip, the place where grey was beginning to thread into the black at his temples, the way his eyes held the dim light. After is now. He did not look away. She had watched this man for 5 years in every condition, exhausted, focused, angry, rarely, carefully neutral, often. And in that brief open instant in Ashgard's courtyard, that he had not known anyone was observing, she had catalogued him the way she had once catalogued threats, out of the same instinct, and what she had collected was this: he was more careful with things he valued. He was less careful with things he was afraid of losing. "You are the first thing," he said, "in my entire life, that I have wanted to do anything for that was not required of me." She waited. "I have wanted," he said, with the careful delivery of a man who has chosen each word individually and discarded many others, to stand beside you, not because you needed it, because I could not think of anywhere else I wanted to be. The distance between them, she would have said a foot. It was less. The warmth from his chest reached her through the cold spring air without either of them having moved. She could see him breathing. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. His skin was very warm. He closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. When he opened them, something behind them had changed, not opened exactly, but arrived at a place it had been moving toward for a long time. He brought his forehead down to hers. They stood like that in the cold spring evening, with the valley going dark below them, and the sound of wind in the distant birches, and everything that had accumulated over 5 years of proximity and restraint, and the very careful management of distance, was now simply present between them, acknowledged, held. There was nothing else to say. They had already said it all in other languages, in the firelight and the old books and the 60 centimeters of charged air beside a campfire in the 3rd year, in every deliberate step back, and every almost and every not yet. He kissed her. She kissed him back. 3 months after that. Nara found out the way. Nara found out everything. By looking. She came into the training yard on a morning that smelled of warming stone and green things, pushing up through old snow, assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds, said oh no, in a tone that managed to combine horror and absolute delight in equal measure, and then laughed so loudly that Cain put his head around the corner from the corridor to see what had died. "Don't tell him before I do," Seraphine said. Nara's hands found hers and held them and did not let go. Her face, when she looked up, was doing something she clearly couldn't help. "I don't need to." Her smile broke wide and warm and entirely involuntary. "He already knows. He's known since yesterday." Since. She turned. Riven was standing at the far end of the corridor. He had clearly been about to go somewhere else, and had stopped. He was very still. His eyes, when they found hers, were not grey. They were gold. She had not known, until this moment, what that meant, had not thought to ask, had not found it in any of the old lichen texts she'd read in the library on cold nights. The color was warm and deep, like late afternoon sun on stone, like something lit from inside. She walked toward him and the distance closed between them, not in the hesitant step-and-step-back way it had spent 5 years closing, but simply, directly, the way rivers move when the gradient is no longer in question. He reached out. His thumb found the inside of her left wrist. The scar there, the one shaped like a closed eye, and pressed against it gently, just as he'd done once by accident in a cave in the Silver Forest when neither of them had known what anything meant yet. She turned her wrist over and laced her fingers through his. He looked down at their joined hands. His jaw worked once, the way it did when he was arriving at something he would not find the words for immediately. "You are not someone who survived the winter," he said. He had said it once before, in a different form, a lifetime ago. "I know." She looked up at him. "I became the storm." And then quietly, we both did. Below the citadel, the valley was green. In the birch forests at its edge, something was moving. A pale shape, briefly visible between the trunks, following a line of tracks through the last of the spring snow. And at the distant border of Silberwald, a man who had once been a king looked out at the tree line and saw, in the morning light, the print of a silver paw moving westward through the world he had forfeited. He did not call out. He watched the tracks until they were past seeing. Then he turned and went back to his small work, in his small space, which was the shape of what he had made of himself, and which was, at last, honest. She did not only survive the winter. She became the storm. And the storm found the one person who stood inside it without looking for shelter.